Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at a video from Spencer's Adventures where he discusses the value of a MacBook and what it brings to the table in the modern era. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, then you will know that I'm a big opponent of Apple and a huge advocate for companies like Framework. However, I do see the inherent value of Apple's silicon and the efficiency that they provide. I have my complaints about their lockdown nature and the ideology of how business is done over at Apple, but I felt it was good to give a full-rounded view of what I do and don't like about Apple, and I thought a great way to showcase this was to use Spencer as an example, who in my opinion goes about using Apple products the most efficient way that I have seen. Spencer is a YouTuber who really places a value on frugality and making the most out of your purchases, and it's always thrown me off that someone with such values would be so willing to purchase and stay within Apple's ecosystem for so long. That said, when I saw after a series of videos of him exploring Linux and other cheaper hardware, and then showcasing the M1 MacBook, I have to admit, it's given me a bit of inspiration and open-mindedness to at least consider Apple hardware in the future. But only if the price is right, which we will see here shortly is the case for Spencer.
Has 32 gigs of memory and 512 gigs of storage. When this machine was new, Apple was charging around 3,000 Canadian dollars for it in the spec that I have it. And with tax, that would be even closer to $3,300 or $3,500. And if you'd bought a similarly spec'd M Series Pro today, you'd be in the same ballpark. I got this computer for less than half of its new price, for 1,400 Canadian dollars, no tax. But folks, here's the real point. If you're frugal like me, you probably don't want to pay full price for any of this. And folks, you don't have to. You can unlock massive savings by buying secondhand. Because what happens here is simple. All of these previous generations of machines, be it M1, M2, M3, M4, they all come on the secondhand market for a great price. And suddenly you have access to a bunch of high-end performant tools for a fraction of what they were at retail.
Spencer makes an excellent point about buying secondhand. If you're not a fan of paying the MSRP price of any product that will just depreciate in a mere couple of years, you absolutely should be looking towards buying secondhand. You don't need the latest and greatest chipsets that's currently being offered in the modern day, especially when the modern day has the same architecture as a year prior with minor spec upgrades. The only difference being that there may be a new feature. I mean, Nvidia is horrible about this with their misleading advertising. If you remember when the RTX 5070 was announced, they advertised it as being just as performative and powerful as the RTX 4090, but at a fraction of the cost. Now, obviously they were implying that that performance came with multi-frame generation enabled, meaning you would be using fake AI generated frames and fake AI upscaling to mimic the power of what the 4090 could bring you, raw. But you see, the idea is that they can sell less and then charge more on a much slower scale over time. But if you don't know what I mean, I would recommend you to just Google it yourself, but Google now is opting to no longer focus on being a search engine and would rather just become an AI chat that will answer your questions. That's a whole topic for another time though. What I want to focus on though is, what does all this have in common? What is the product's power and software functionality or versatility being determined by the manufacturer have in common? That, my friend, is a very scary thing that even Apple themselves have intentions of with their own current line of silicon called planned obsolescence.
As somebody who's very Linux curious, I often find myself prowling Facebook Marketplace looking for deals on things like ThinkPads. But what I'm often surprised by is just how little difference there is in price between some of these ThinkPad models and what I paid for my MacBook Pro. And while the ThinkPads are more repairable, which we'll come back to a little later, when it comes to a task like video editing or even screen or speaker performance, the MacBook definitely is ahead.
You see, planned obsolescence is the concept that once a developer or the maintainer of a piece of hardware or software decides not to continue or support your device anymore, they opt to support the newer device or the newer product that ultimately you're going to have to buy. And Apple's history of discontinuing support for their MacBooks is usually about 7 to 8 years. And that means that if Spencer plans to use this until Apple officially stops supporting the MacBook M1 chip with the software and security updates, he's currently got about only a year or two left of real world use. Obviously he could continue to use it after, but if something were to go wrong, Apple's not really going to step in and fix it. He's going to be left to have to go and hunt down and find a new, better deal or a bargain. Now, maybe he'll get more mileage out of it if Apple were to extend their security updates separate from their software updates. But given that he's had this MacBook for about a year and a half now, he could ultimately get 3 to 4 years out of it for the $1,400 that he spent. And that's only 3 to 4 years. And for $1,400, that is just 3 to 4 years that you can really get usage out of something before it's time to seriously consider upgrading. See, if you were wanting to purchase this MacBook at the original time of release, let's say it was going for like $3,300 that he mentions at the beginning of this video, possibly $3,300 after tax, you'd be getting a value of spending about $470 a year, $471 a year, I think, when you round everything up for a fully functioning and supported computer. With the time of purchase for Spencer, when he got it, he's guaranteed to get about $467 a year of usage of value if we were to round it up. So while he's coming out relatively on top as far as a deal goes, that's a $4 difference. So when there's that $4 difference, but there's ultimately a set expiration date coming from Apple on the software side of things, it sort of feels like you're getting the full MSRP value. Now, obviously you spent less out of your pocket, but you're going to have to ultimately go back and look for a new computer really soon, probably in the next year or two, like I said earlier, because if the MacBook released in late 2020, this thing will be discontinued support-wise by the end of 2027, maybe early to mid 2028. However, this all could become outdated information that will age like milk. Apple may support their own silicon for much longer than the 7 to 8 years that they used to support their Intel series MacBooks, but they haven't really made any statement about that yet, so history is our only place to look in regards as to what to expect for the future of Apple's support. All this is to make the point that if you're okay with putting in the extra effort to hunt down and bargain and make a deal with a potentially iCloud locked device, this is undoubtedly a better deal than just buying it brand new. But with such a minimal price difference, it really just depends on what money you have in that moment to spend and what makes more sense to you. Personally, an eBay deal is pretty sketchy, especially with Apple's poor repairability cost, and if you're looking to use this device for your business. If you can find the deal that Spencer did, that's great. But if not, then I would recommend some alternative options.
And it really is impressive to me that this 5-year-old computer is just so capable at handling everything that I throw at it here in 2026. Whether it's video editing here on YouTube, where I occasionally bring in 6K footage and don't have to worry about using proxies. As a musician, I'm often recording stuff in Logic or GarageBand. And throughout the year, I rent this out at my film work as a data managing tool, and it never gives me any trouble.
I don't want to harp too long on the video production end of things that Spencer mentions because, well, let's just be honest. There is no portable laptop currently at $1,400 that can edit videos as efficiently as a MacBook in any category, mainly in the M series, but even this M1 Max chip, nothing's beating it at $1,400. So not much to say there. If that's what you're using it for and it's for work, and your work is to edit videos, what a great steal. What an amazing buy. Good for Spencer and good for you, frankly. Now, that said, everything else that you would have to do as far as audio production and whatnot, all of this is capable. All of this is entirely possible with Linux. And Linux is an amazing option that you can take advantage of for any industry, really. The biggest limitation for people who are stuck on Mac or stuck on Windows is always, well, I can't use this one piece of software. However, right now I'm editing this video with DaVinci Resolve under Linux. Now, I'm not using a laptop, I'm using a desktop. So that's why I'm able to work as efficiently as I do on this channel. Ignore the fact that I've been missing for the last 3 weeks. That's a personal issue I had in my life that has nothing to do with my hardware. But all this software is primarily developed for Mac and Windows because they can easily develop it for these platforms and then license it out and sell it. And also there's just more people using these platforms. With Linux growing in popularity, maybe we'll see more first-party proprietary software be an option on Linux that you could use for professional work. Now, the only issue is your codecs. So I mentioned I use DaVinci Resolve Studio, and the biggest nightmare I have with this software is the codecs. I cannot import AAC audio, which is like the most common audio you're going to find anywhere. So I'm always having to convert it into FLAC audio, or just use WAVE audio. And that works great inside of DaVinci Resolve. And the reason that it doesn't support it is because there's licensing issues with, AAC codecs or even H.264 or H.265. You get the idea, where they're not allowed to include it because they don't technically have support for it, because those are proprietary codecs, and distributions like Ubuntu or Fedora or CachyOS or what have you, they're not allowed to ship with these codecs. So it's left to you to find an alternative. But with so many open source codecs that sound great, I don't understand why it's such a big deal and a licensing issue for people to just stay on these codecs. My theory is that a lot of people aren't too familiar with codecs. They understand what a WAV file is and they understand AAC. I mean, ultimately, that's all I understand about it, but I'm able to understand that there are open source alternatives to what already works. So why is it that we don't ultimately use that as a society and as users of tech in the digital art world? I'm not too familiar with software on Linux that could be used for making music because, well, that's just not me. But I know there's a program called LMMS, which is supposed to be an alternative to like Fruity Loop Studios and GarageBand. However, I'm not well versed in that area. I'm not going to speak on that being a one-to-one replacement. I do know, though, that when there's professional suites out there like DaVinci Resolve for the video editing world, there is no reason that there couldn't be professional licensed audio suites that could work on Linux down the road. And I hope one day that we can find a laptop that is just as powerful as the M1 MacBook and give me the ability to edit videos on Linux on the go. And there might be an option coming up here really soon.
However, my biggest concern with this computer is a general concern I have with Apple, and that is repairability. And Apple doesn't have a great track record when it comes to that. And this lack of repairability that Apple has, the fact that I don't feel super aligned with the values of this company, it just makes me all the more happy that I'm not paying them directly and buying secondhand. I am hopeful that the tide is moving that way with releases like the MacBook Neo, which seem to be Apple's most repairable laptop in the last 10 or more years. However, I can't help but feel that they're just doing it because their hands have been forced. That's why I've become increasingly interested in companies like Framework. They're building laptops that are repairable, modular, and even upgradable. And honestly, I've even considered switching at some point and changing my workflow over to a Linux one because I respect that direction. That said, when it comes to an integrated experience, Apple has that nailed. Everyone knows this, but if you have an iPhone or a Mac or an iPad, any of these tools, they work together seamlessly. It's pretty hard to beat that level of polish.
And this is where I'm going to nerd out for a little bit. Spencer and you, the viewer, should absolutely give Linux a serious shot with some serious hardware. And unfortunately, that's not really an option with the newer M series MacBooks. I know that there is Asahi Linux, but it's not really fully developed and supported yet. You're not going to get the full GPU acceleration out of it. You're going to have much better export renders coming from Apple's macOS and Apple's Final Cut all intertwined. Mainly because it's all created by them, but also because it's proprietary. So nobody is able to get in and look and see how they are achieving such efficiency. It's more of a secret that Apple doesn't put out there. And if you're doing business level work where you're having to output more quantity than quality, and you're moving a lot of money around to do it, I can understand the need to have something that you know is more stable and just works coming from Apple. I get it. I personally, though, running my own business, that being with this YouTube channel, would really prefer to avoid Apple at all products. Although I said at the beginning of this video that I am more open-minded to the idea of using Apple hardware, the whole point of values to me is that nothing is kept secret as far as the tools that I use, because when things are kept secret, you don't understand how they're working, you don't know what it's taking from you, and you don't know what you stand to lose. You might wonder how I can say that with such a straight face while editing a video on DaVinci Resolve Studio, a proprietary piece of software, and utilizing the full power of it with an NVIDIA GPU, a proprietary driver that's within the Linux kernel. The reason for that is because it is my choice to use that as a tool to edit videos for this content. It is my choice to use that for getting the performance out of my games that I would like. Now, that all said, I'm choosing to have the entire kernel and operating system open source. Everything that goes through this computer could be audited by me. And if I really wanted to, I could use some open source NVIDIA drivers, or I could go out and I could purchase an AMD GPU and run open source drivers on my PC. To touch back earlier to what I said about planned obsolescence, that's not really a thing in Linux. Now, Linux has a million different distributions that if something doesn't work, you could hop over to another distribution, as so long as you're keeping all of your data backed up, you can just distro hop and find the one that works best for you. And there's even a tool called DistroBox that lets you run different distros within a container inside of your distro. So that's really great for projects like DaVinci Box. If you can't get it running on your preferred distro, you could run DistroBox, install DaVinci Resolve in there, say under Fedora or Rocky Linux or whatever, and then you'll be able to run a fully compatible and fully functioning DaVinci Resolve on, say, your Arch Linux setup. But there is no planned obsolescence with Linux. The end date is literally theoretically infinite, based off the fact that you can jump across different distributions depending on whatever maintainer you want, and there's no money to be spent switching to a new distribution of Linux. It's all free and open source software, so you get to choose what you want when you want it. Ultimately, I'm given choice, and that isn't something that is really given to you with a MacBook, other than, do you want this much or this little? And if you choose the little option, you're always going to be throttled at a high price point. And if you choose this much, then you're ultimately paying more money than is really necessary for what you're getting. And that's why I really love Framework. They try to make themselves a Linux first laptop company, but ultimately they have to be a Windows first laptop company to get themselves into the circulation that they would like to be, which they have grown phenomenally the last 5 or 6 years that they've been around. So I have no doubts when it comes to their hardware and Linux compatibility that I'm going to get a professional grade experience with this new Framework 13 Pro. That said, currently I edit my videos on a desktop. I do have an NVIDIA GPU in here with a Ryzen CPU, and Linux outperforms my Windows computer. Everything is just smooth. Everything is just, to quote Apple, it just works, and it's made me think different about how I use computers. When Spencer is testing out Linux and video editing on a T480, the reason that it may not be the greatest comparison is because it is a T480. It is not a video editing or gaming machine that you would get from, say, a gaming PC or a MacBook for the video editing. I strongly recommend that if you're watching this, Spencer, or if you the viewer are watching, you got to give Linux a serious shot on some serious hardware, and try to be a little bit open-minded with some workarounds with codecs for your video and your audio and whatnot. I would highly recommend that if you're going to edit videos on Linux, Kdenlive is all right, but you should pay the $300 and get yourself DaVinci Resolve Studio. And if you really wanted to, go get yourself a camera from Blackmagic, like the Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. I think even for about $1,000 will include a license of DaVinci Resolve Studio with that purchase. Typically, I don't know what they're offering today, but I know in the past that's been like a bundled offer they typically would include. So there's my 2 cents for you. I'm very excited to see what the Framework 13 Pro has to offer, but until then, find yourself some real powerful hardware to test Linux on. I think you'll be surprised.
I mean, I'm already a pretty edge case as it is. I'm a full-time filmmaker as well as content creator who uses this laptop for my job, and this is more than enough for me. And I couldn't have afforded to buy a full-price MacBook Pro at the time that I bought this, even if I wanted to. And I think that really highlights the superpower of buying secondhand. It gives you access to tools that you could never have afforded otherwise, and it allows you to build a stack of high-powered but accessible tools at a price that you can pay.
And Spencer really just puts it excellently here, and is the reason why that I will never shame anybody for purchasing anything secondhand. I think that it is possible to still buy things secondhand and avoid Apple and use a more open and friendly platform like Linux. However, if this is what you know, that being Apple and that whole ecosystem, absolutely buy it secondhand and do not give Apple your money, because we live in a world where we really got to start voting with our wallets. And if you don't hand your money over to people like Apple, who will ultimately limit and neuter your experience based off of what they think is necessary, you're going to find yourself screwed over, as opposed to keeping your money and then just moving over to Linux if you have hardware that's already decently powerful enough. I would argue that the final iterations of the Intel MacBooks that can run Linux completely natively could give you some decent performance with video editing, music production, etc. Now, maybe you're not going to get the sweet performance of an M series chip, but you can still at least hold on to that old MacBook you have if you're still holding on to an Intel, and make it work for just even a little bit longer until companies like Framework can come out and be more populated and their prices can eventually come down to where it's more reasonable to purchase, say, the upcoming Intel Core Ultra 3 X9 chip that they'll be launching. And eventually when RAM prices come down and storage prices come down, and who knows, at this point, a couple years, maybe 5 years, you're going to be able to totally ditch Apple and leave them in the dust, in my opinion. And that's an exciting future that I can't wait to see. And in the meantime, if we don't give our money to Apple and we buy secondhand, we very easily could get Apple to start implementing practices just like Framework currently is. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for watching. I wanted to make a little announcement that I have created an X account. If you happen to use X or Twitter and you want to follow me, go ahead and follow me there. There will be a link in the description. Also, go check out Spencer's channel and go give his video an actual watch. Go ahead and leave it a like. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.